All right, so we're back again with our conversation on the glory of the Lord, theological aesthetics, seeing the form by Hans von Balthasar. Um, we are continuing our discussion of the experience of faith. Balthasar dives into a variety of ways and one can experience God, and sort of describes a variety of figures, um, and what that experience of God was like, John, Mary, and so on. So again, another dense, rich uh, section of this book. So we're excited to begin continue our conversation, and those of you who are listening in with us, we hope that you are continuing to enjoy it.
I was excited because I'm not sure if you can tell, but we're more than halfway through. Yeah, it felt like when we started, like we're never going to finish this thing. This is going to be, the rest of our lives just to finish this one book. But we are actually more than halfway, barely more than halfway done. And given, he talked about, Mary and John, John of Patmos of the Revelation gets a lot of attention. Well, not a lot, a good amount of attention. But it is, like you suggested, it's scripturally focused experience. He's not talking about people in church who suddenly speak in tongues, or the devout person next to you kneeling at mass, or the person who goes and prays to Mary every day. This is a very scriptural theological look at the experience of faith.
Right, exactly. And he takes us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, saying how, here how very, right, like throughout salvation history, here's what the experience of God has looked like, culminating, as we were talking about before we hit record, culminating in the sort of embodied experience of Christ. Christ, who is God, taking on human form, being fully human, fully divine, and now what that experience and presentation looks like and does for, say, the apostles and others.
Yeah, I mean, it talked about, and we were talking this again earlier, the Old Testament, you hear that God was standing under a tree talking to Abraham. You hear about these very personal encounters with God. But even though they are he talks about the experience is the whole person, physical and spiritual. There is maybe a little bit of infantilization, I think, in his depiction of the Old Testament experience, or primitivism in it, in the way they come. But I think for me, one of the main takeaways is like there is this combination of this direct personalist interaction with God, that God comes down. I avoided saying appeared, because even though people do seem to see God, they stand and talk to God, there is a difference between that and the incarnation. That the flesh is absent in the Old Testament, whereas this personal appearance by Christ is what makes the New Testament so important. But then also the apostles, you have like Mary gets a lot, and she's a very special case. With the apostles, it is they're passing on that we have a directing that's both direct and mediated through hearing the words of the apostles. That they're passing on their personal direct experience of an embodied God to us. And through that, we also get that direct embodied experience. But he does note that, he doesn't use the word hearsay, but that we are getting it mediated.
Right. Right. Exactly. I think in the Old Testament, as you said, we have various times where somebody is speaking to God, but it's almost like an abstraction in some ways, right? Like Moses with the flame, but it sort of becomes concrete or concretized in Jesus.
That is true. There is almost an evolution of Abraham standing on a tree talking to God, and then Moses talking to a burning bush. I mean, there's a bush there, but it's different from, Abraham almost appearing to talk to another person. That we are having this sort of weird evolution away from that Old Testament, merciless God of Elijah and Abraham, then to Moses and the kings of Israel, and the prophets, or I should say Israel and Judea, the prophets, and then to the very different personal, because embodied experience of the New Testament.
Right. Yeah. What did you think of? Because obviously we started this section. We read from 293 to 407 for this one. What did you think of the form of his presentation here? Because we start with obviously the archetype, Jesus's experience of God, the Old Testament, and then we're sort of presented with a few figures, the Marian experience of God, apostles, then Peter, Paul, John, Marian, the church and the Christian, spiritual senses, mysticism within the church, ending with integration. So, like, what do you think? What does Balthasar want us to learn from this section? Or what do you think?
There is, I mean, I'm not sure how well it all progresses. And one thing I had was that when he talks about archetypes, and he uses this in very important sounding ways, these archetypes, these spiritual archetypes of spiritual experience. It's like, well, what are the archetypes? What is, like, are the ones he lists? Are these it? Is archetype, obviously I know there's an archetype, but is this like a particular Balthasarian definition? I feel like he could have stood to define his terms a bit more. I felt I got a lot. We both really enjoyed, and I think were challenged by the Marian, the Marian archetype or Marian experience, of that, Christ being God, being embodied, Christ being embodied, but then like this special experience of that embodiment in Mary, and her ability, or the fact that she now contains everything in a way, and that she is subsumed into the ultimate being of God. And it's really fascinating. I think it does, just my own spiritual life, a better understanding of why Mary is important, and providing a more theological basis rather than sort of that instinctive emotional basis. We appreciate Mary because sometimes you need to talk to a mom.
Yeah. I want to point people to that section, the Marian section, because the way Balthasar describes this, about this ES and what it does, for her, that was just sort of deeply striking.
Here, and one thing I saw, I did see this in Mary. I saw a bit of the philosopher Berkeley and his empirical account of where we only exist because God is watching us. And I felt there's some touches of that. And I did see that early on in the marrying experience of God. This is separate from the discussion we're having. Just that I noted that Berkeley seemed to come up for me. Never cited, but some Berkeleyan ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so I found that section here. So so Mary's whole experience, this is on 332, as it develops from its earliest beginnings, is an experience for others, for all. It is an expropriated experience for the benefit of all. The experience not only of being dispossessed of her child, beginning when he was 12 years old, continuing through his public life, and culminating in his passion in the founding of the church, obviously referencing that sort of the loss where they think they've lost Jesus and he's at the temple, he's beginning traveling and then the crucifixion. But of being dispossessed of experience itself, as if the mother must increasingly renounce everything vitally personal to her for the sake of the church, in the end to be left like a plundered tree with nothing but her naked faith. Behold, there is your son. Progressively, every shade of personal intimacy is taken from her to be increasingly applied to the good of the church and Christians, to be bestowed on these, together with the grace of Christ, a grace which is both human and divine, and which is therefore replete with Christ's human experiences of God. Now, again, what struck me about initially reading that, a plundered tree, loss of personal experience. I remember when I sat with it, I said, I've never heard Mary's life being described that way. What her initial yes led to. And I think without the proper lens, somebody could read that and go, this sounds horrifying, right? Like somebody's entire life has been taken, and there's a loss here. There's no gain. But again, like what we're reminded of there is that the faith is one of self-emptying, right? Jesus tells us that we must if we lose ourselves, we will gain everything, right? So this sort of self-emptying and ordering ourselves to to him will lead to a kind of transformation, right? So in effect, I mean, Mary is showing us the kind of model of what it looks like to have a vocation in the church, right? Like this sort of self-giving. I am binding myself to this for and giving myself to this for this greater purpose. And again, and I think that's the proper way to read that. Balthasar obviously, it continues. This is Mary as a sort of distinct human being, right? But again, I think this is a way for us, this self-emptying, to find God. Like this is something that we can take away from the text just for practical matters. I mean, I think this is why so many people find a deeper experience of life when they give themselves to service and to charity, because this is, there's something beyond the personal, beyond one's interests that are just sort of fleeting. And again, this is, I think this is also why Peter Kraft has described Mary as like the first philosopher, theologian, I think. So we can kind of see that there. Obviously somebody could distort that, right, and say, well, this is why women shouldn't do anything, right? Like certain, certain people who would distort scripture for that kind of thing. But this is what I think it's teaching us. This is a really deep sense of meaning that we can get through self-emptying.
That plunder tree it's a risky metaphor, but a powerful one, and not an unexpected, because it's not the language necessarily used to. Every so often he brings out some really great figurative language, but it's not a common thing, at least so far for Balthasar. And yeah, that's that. And the vocation, like her the first vocation, in a way, the first New Testament vocation was Mary's, which I hadn't thought of before. I saw on that same page, 332, towards the end. In Mary, believers possess experiences in which they have not enjoyed personally, but which have been communicated them by grace. And this sort of foreshadows what's going to happen in the next bit, apostolic experiences, where we're taking on the accounts that we are experiencing Christ, and experiencing in a very real way, through the very personal, experience of the apostles encountering Jesus.
Right.
I think it's no surprise that even though, Paul called himself an apostle, that he does separate the apostolic from the Pauline experience, because there's a second level of mediation for Paul, and I think he points that as a key. Is it's in a way the opposite of Mary. Mary present. I was going to say present creation. Actually, she was, by being Queen of God, Mother of God, or not Queen of the Universe, Mother of God. In a way, she was present at the creation,
right,
and part of creation. But Paul is after the experience of, after the eyewitnesses, the embodied, have gone. And looking at this again, I would have sworn that the Marian experience of God went on for pages and pages and pages, because it felt so powerful. Looking at it, I was like, oh, this is really just like, 5 or 6 pages. It blew me away right there, because there felt like there was so much in there, and it was such a powerful bit.
Oh, definitely.
But and thinking of the aesthetic again, and this comes up a lot as he gets towards the end of the section of the experience of faith. And where is it? With the section on mysticism, but once he gets past these archetypes, vision comes up a lot. And he says about we talked before, if he tends to fall back on vision as the primary aesthetic experience or aesthetic example. Occasionally he gets into taste, he gets into sound, but he seems to come back to vision a lot. I'm not sure whether that's a tick, his own thing, or important, but on the apostolic, eyewitness in turn has such a fundamental form. It is association with the Lord in his public life. That's the beginning of the first full chapter on page 333. And obviously, I don't have that eyewitness, but similar to, Mary, we can experience of Mary through grace. We can experience what the apostles saw through the Gospels.
Right.
And it is not, look, obviously it is diminished, but it's not diminished to the point that we're not also actively participating in a real experience of Christ. And he doesn't make, to my memory, any mention of the Eucharist there. So he's not talking about that presence. It is, reading the gospel, participating in the gospel, gives us this real experience. I actually thought about some, and I won't say for certain, but I believe that the majority of Islamic theology believes that the reading of the Quran, that is God. And I found that hard to understand at the time. I wasn't Catholic. It wasn't until later with, understanding the real presence in the Eucharist. Like, this is Christ, that I got a better understanding of that. And he doesn't go that far, because Christ was embodied. And so he's going to be present in a physical form. But there is something of that in the, reading and believing and trusting the gospel accounts. We have we participate in the real experience they had.
Right. And I think, his presentation on seeing and vision led him, that is Balthasar, to some interesting engagement towards the end. I mean, our old friend Claudel appears, right, with the odes, right? So,
about the poet Paul Claudel.
yes, yeah. So, I thought that it was interesting that Balthasar is sort of pulling from a variety of figures, including Claudel, theologians, etc., to say, here's what one's vision of God or experience of God might look like.
And that might be one of the first times that I can remember where, he doesn't say bring up Paul Claudel exclusively as a poet, but I think the first time bringing up someone who is primarily a producer of things of aesthetic value rather than a theologian or a scriptural figure. And I'm not sure what that means. I'm still not entirely sure what he'll ultimately define aesthetic as or beauty as. But this is, I think, the first time I can recall where he brings up someone who produced a aesthetic artifact.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want to perhaps turn to the. So that's on page 351 and 352. Whether or not one rejects, so applied to Jesus, John's words would then mean that what is promised to the disciples is the vision of the unification, ascending and descending of Christ's heavenly glory with his fleshly form on earth. Whether or not one rejects this interpretation, the Johannine Christology of pre-existence nonetheless points in this direction. But Matthew's statement, on the other hand, tends to indicate a vicarious vision on the part of the angel to whom is assigned the little one on earth. The little ones are not to be despised because the reality rises up even to the open vision of God, which is implied in the vision already given them, Psalm 352 now, even if they do not perceive it with their earthly consciousness. The inspiration and guidance that comes to them from the vision of their angel binds their existence below with their existence above, according to the church's measure. So obviously we have a theological reflection there. And then we go into the odes. Behold, Jerusalem and Zion embraced like two sisters, the one coming from heaven and the other in exile, washing in the river Kobar, the linen used in sacrifices. And the earthly church raises her tower-crowned head towards her royal consort. And just as the sun's eruptions reverberate on earth in the form of droughts and spring tides, so too from the sublimest angel who beholds thee down to the pebble in the path, and from one end of thy creation to the other, the continuum never ceases, not any more than from soul to body. The unspeakable soar of the seraphim expands through the 9 orders of spirits, and among all thy creatures and all the way to thee there is a liquid bond. So the poet here is speaking in both a cosmic and ecclesiological sense, or as an image from Dennis, the Areopagite, around which Eric Peterson also constructed his treatise on the angels. So a lot going on there, but I just thought that was really interesting that he turned to a poet, as we said, versus say, a theologian or even a philosopher.
Just as a side note, I was assuming that Dennis the Areopagite was pseudo-Dionysus. Are you assuming that too, or do you have a better knowledge of that? Or is there another Areopagite?
Yeah, I think that's. I was also assuming that because, in part, it is the same person. I just checked. So, in part because so much of our philosophy and art and beauty reading, I think, was contained not only when we did the introduction, but so much of what he is addressing here, we ourselves had to read. You know,
I think we do need to get to Paul because he's important, because there's this additional mediation, and that's what this. If I recall, this is from the Pauline section, right?
yeah,
Or no, sorry, that
that was the John.
Johannine,
Yeah.
by which he means John Patmos, author of Revelation. But my hobby horse is Plato in this, and his relationship to Plato. Alfred North Whitehead, I believe it was he that said that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, that Balthasar appears to be trying to make Plato a footnote. We talked about him rescuing the word gnosis, while still acknowledging Gnosticism and the Gnostics as being heretical. At one point, he associates them with Neoplatonism. There's a bit that I actually took to suggest that Plato's cave is not compatible with the Christian idea of salvation. And just, I put some notes down. He's not saying being anti-Platonic, and I think I might have said this before, but he is being resolutely non-Platonic. And just almost saying like saying, yes, I love Italian food, but right now we're talking about German cooking. Okay. Yeah. So is that it's really, there'll be some footnotes there, but he's really has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And, this I think is going to continue to be one of my hobby horses throughout. But something that kind of came to the fore even more. And I think we saw some of his most direct attacks on Plato here.
That's right.
And, one of the reading bits we read there talked about form. That there's, I'm not sure where he's going to go, because we talked before, the word form is used a lot, and we always wonder, it's definitely not the Platonic form, except when it is. But as I do want to go back to Paul, because he is engagement with the incarnated, embodied Lord, but also after the death.
Right.
And the Pauline section starts on 343. He's got a nice. The Pauline tradition, on the other hand, will mean the continued fostering of Paul's view of Revelation. On the other hand, it will also mean the ever new and unforeseen vertical eruption of the new charisms in the history of the church. And though obviously you have Paul's understanding that Gentiles can become Christians, that the issues of circumcision and Jewish dietary restrictions being optional. But I think there is an eruption now because, and I should say it's IRRUPT. This is after Christ. His experience of Christ is not with the embodied Christ. It is with the resurrected Christ.
Right.
And, Paul introducing, what does it mean to be a follower of Christ when you can no longer encounter Christ the way the apostles did. You can encounter, and, leading up to the reading Paul Claudel, the word vicarious is used for the angel watching over Jesus. I think that's a great word if we can, not attach to it any negative connotations or implications, that, we can experience Christ vicariously,
right,
through the gospel, through the accounts of the apostles, including Paul and his encounter with Christ. The Pauline revelation on the road to Damascus, which I was thinking about because I had a friend at a prayer group talk about he wished he could have that experience. Sometimes on a spiritual level, we can feel lost. And the clarity of having, God knock us off our horse and blind us for a couple of days and say, "Hey, here I am. What are you doing?"
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, just as an aside, I mean, I remember when I was discerning my vocation, I wanted to be knocked off my proverbial horse because I was like, I just want to make the right decision. But um, most of us are not going to be blessed with such an event as was Paul. So, yeah.
And perhaps in some way, some we're reading is about how we, as people who did not, we did not carry the Lord, the incarnation, but through grace, as noted, we can participate in it. Through the Gospels, through the letters of Paul, we can have a very real participation, even if we don't get the clarity. And maybe the clarity is an important word because it's primarily about visual acuity, and that for Balthasar, the primary psychic experience is visual. And just while flipping through, I came across a bit I highlight, and this is a section called the Church and the Christians, on page 342. And the main question, this is the first full paragraph in 342. Therefore is, in what manner is the archetypal Christian experience incorporated into the church so that members who are not graced with it can nevertheless participate in it? And so actually, maybe that answers a question I asked earlier. I just didn't pick it up early. That the archetypes are these pre-me, and pre all of us, encounters with God. The Old Testament encounters with God, of talking to the burning bush, talking to God under a tree, of prophets who are directly hearing from God. Marian archetype of participating in the embodiment of God in the world. The apostles who saw God, who directly encountered him. And even though, and then the Pauline, of the encounter after Christ's death, but also still in that period. The apostles are still around. And he does go on, he has like the Petrine tradition, Peter, the first pope, the rock upon whom the church was built. I'm not always sure about the order of this. I felt like, I guess maybe in this section of, the church and the Christian, he is setting up for this post-resurrection, post-death, and that's why Peter and Paul are after that. That's about building the church. I think it might have been helpful if that had come afterwards, after
Right.
Peter and Paul, maybe after Johannine, which for me is less integral, but that's also one of my personal things. I'm not a big fan of the Book of Revelation, as it was cool when I was young, but now this is a pure, obviously I respect it and recognize it as scripture on a purely aesthetic level. It is the least favorite of any part of the Bible. I find sorry, St. John. I find the metaphors and the allegories to be a little too clunky and on the nose sometimes. And I did read somewhere that he was a terrible writer in New Testament Greek. And so it's wrote that no other book of the Bible has benefited so much by translation. I can't verify that. I do not speak any kind of Greek, including New Testament Greek or modern Greek. So, but that kind of struck me, because when you're young, maybe especially a young man, you're like, oh yeah, stop being blasted. There are monsters. It sounds very cool. We like apocalyptic stuff. As I get older, I go to other parts of the Bible.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, I think with this Paul section too, I came across something that we can draw attention to. It's another sense of the change in the person, the kind of reordering of the person. Paul obviously is sort of the sine qua non of that, right? Or when we talk about the whole Saul to Paul thing, which I found out, by the way, was not entirely true. I think he was. I think Jewish people at the time were given a Jewish name and a kind of Romanized Latin name. So I think he used Paul when he was trying to evangelize the Latin world and everything, but never lost the Saul thing. I read that somewhere. But nevertheless, I think we see a connection here with Mary. So I just want to read this section here in 346. When Peter exhorts his followers to be good shepherds and examples to the flock, Paul knows from the outset that he is a spectacle for angels and men. In his existence may be plainly read what man is seen from above, even as one who is crucified with Christ and who daily dies with him. He is in the eyes of all a living anticipation of the eschatological promise. He not only shows, he infuses his vision in a certainty of salvation into the church. Irresistibly, he draws the community into his joy, his parisia, his zeal, his prayer, his Catholic love. He works through contagion, which again, an interesting word to use. Like, as we pointed out earlier, we see the plundered tree. Now we see evangelization as a kind of virus or something moving through. But
watching Christ as vicarious. Yeah, he likes actively. He's a little provocative sometimes in his work, or at least the translators. But I have to think it's deliberate on the part of Balthasar and the translators carrying that. Otherwise, why in heaven's name would you choose the word contagion?
That's right. Even when in a Petrine sense, he had to distinguish between himself and the others. He acts as a binding force by receiving within himself and saying we instead of I. So there's that loss of the I in a way. The I becomes the we. And also throughout this entire book, just as an aside, I've noticed, Balthasar uses that I thou formulation that Martin Buber also did. And again, that sort of I thou relationship is a we, right? Like we are, it's creating a kind of community, a group relationship. This is the identity at once bestowed and striven for between official apostleship and personal sanctity. Sanctity as a charge that depersonalizes and ecclesializes the person. The charge to be the light of the church by consuming oneself for all. So again, Paul is fully, as was Mary, fully giving himself to this reality. And I think one thing that we can see is, I think the example of Paul here is important because if we think of Balthasar's use of vision, right? Paul already was a deeply devoted person. He was a religious Pharisee. So he already has, and he obviously views Christianity initially as these sort of usurpers, right? So, but then, after the encounter with the risen Christ, his orientation shifts, but not so much in the sense that he's sort of given the full picture of reality, of what of God, and he says, "I need to do this now," right? So, but instead of, I think that the key change is instead of attempting to sort of stamp out the people he viewed as heretics or religious usurpers or whatever, he becomes meek, right? He lowers himself, right? That's the sort of Christ-like um, uh, dimension that comes to his personality, and his entire self is now given to this thing. The I becomes the we, right? Everything he does is now for Christ, and I liked his formulation there. Ecclesializes the person, right? I think this is something that we often forget. Um, you know, when we are speaking of Jesus, of the church to people, particularly somebody who might be skeptical, you are that moment. You are the church for that person. Your identity is gone. So I know, you and I, in addition to our writing and our, our catechists in a way, right? Like you are a catechist. I teach theology, which is catechesis, right? So I think often of the grave responsibility I have. It's like I am the church for these people, these young minds. So there is a kind of, again, a shift in identity that takes place.
Yeah, and that but that difference, uh, you know, ecclesiological versus the embodied experience of the apostles. And I'm now actually starting to understand why he put church and the Christians before the Petrine, which means Peter after Christ died.
Right.
Because obviously Peter before Christ died is under the apostolic experience or archetype. And then Paul as well is, in a sense, that there is a church,
right,
immediately after Christ dies, or at least after Christ rises.
That's right. Yeah.
Years, but then about its creation, and he doesn't go into it much, but he talks about the Pauline church as being vertical, and it brought up a whole lot for me. Made a whole lot make sense, especially within this context. He talked earlier, not in this section, when in an early discussion we had about the Holy Spirit comes down the same time we reach up. We're, that vertical reaching up. Christ is no longer here. The apostles were reaching laterally. And Christ was reaching laterally to the people around him. And now Christ is ascended. We're reaching up. The church is reaching up. Doesn't mean we don't, evangelize, as you said, that we're not, teaching and passing on the truths, but there is this upward that is different.
Right.
Mary is within, came down within her, the apostles, sat around Christ while he taught. And now, did Christ ever appear to Paul sort of in that lateral? We had like him, Christ above, knocking him off the horse. But I think all of the experiences that might have been his only direct. I know he had visions. He had prophetic visions. That you could eat. You'd have to be circumcised. Gentiles could join. But his experiences with Christ were on a more vertical axis than a horizontal axis.
That's exactly right. Yeah. He had no physical, as in in the flesh encounters with Christ. Yeah.
And then the encounters were even just the way they were sort of situated.
Right.
He didn't physically encounter Christ on the road to Damascus, but he did have an encounter nonetheless. It was vertically oriented. Their appearances of Christ, suddenly walking next to someone after his resurrection.
Right. And they can't recognize him at all.
Paul doesn't have that. Paul doesn't have suddenly Christ. It is always Christ above him.
Right.
And just while thinking, I'm going to make a unusual pitch. I've been thinking about a book I read when I was young called The Kingdom of the Wicked by Anthony Burgess of Clockwork Orange fame. And it is about it goes basically like the death of Christ through the eruption of Vesuvius, and follows not the direct apostle so much, but followers of Christ after Christ's death, a bit of Paul, mostly fictitious characters. And there's one example of a person, who's walking and Christ appears next to him and realizes what it is. And at the end, he says, I forgot to ask Christ to do something about my toothache. Well, yeah, I mean, he's like, well, and then he pulls out himself because, dentistry in the 1st century AD. And says, well, there's some things we can just do for ourselves. We don't need to be asking Christ to fix this.
And by the way, just a quick aside here, obviously in our conversation on Balthasar, but Anthony Burgess, in my view, is one of the great underappreciated Catholic writers of the 20th century, and just a massive body of work, and highly recommend him. I've only read a few of his books, but I think he's somebody he's due for rediscovery by a lot of people, I think.
He's in some ways the anti-Evelyn Waugh.
Yeah.
Like, that people only know one book by Waugh. They know his super Catholic book, Brideshead Revisited, not the rest of his books that were, best known at his own time as a comedian, as a comic right. author. And Burgess, a Catholic author. And not there's not Catholic elements in A Clockwork Orange, but you don't read Clockwork Orange. Certainly don't see the movie. And I go, oh my gosh, I want to pick up a Bible right now. So yeah, that they're both people who are recognized by one book that is sort of sui generis within their genre. But yeah, I've been thinking about that recently. That encounter, and when we ask God for things, of that character going like, I could probably do this myself. Maybe let's not send this all the way upstairs. We talked earlier, we got the more direct attacks on Plato. We got these Berkeleyan, Bishop Berkeley, who is a weird he was empiricist, but also, as the name suggests, deeply religious. He was not Catholic. Was he Anglican, or was he another? I'm assuming Anglican. But he had this idea that empiricism, that things only exist because God is watching us all the time. I'm not sure he's the first to come up with that idea, but there are some touches of that are the experience of God's experience of us is what enables our existence.
And yes, Anglican. So Anglican Church of Ireland, Bishop Berkeley.
After he does the archetypes, and also I realized why I thought the Mary was longer, because there's a second section, the Marian tradition. So there was more, but nonetheless, it wasn't nearly as long as the place it held in my memory. He moves on to the spiritual senses, and we're getting more into the ascetics here. He talks about this 359. Origen constructed a doctrine that there exists a general sense for the divine, subdivided into several kinds. Sense of sight to contemplate supernatural things, a sense of hearing perceives voices that don't resound in the exterior, taste to taste the bread, the Eucharist, smell perceives what Paul describes as we are the fragrance of Christ for God, and a sense of touch, whereby John says that he has touched the word of life with his hands. I think it is maybe no surprise that even though he touches on multiple senses there, the one on sight feels the most complete. The complete quote he takes is A general sense of the divine, which is divided in several kinds, a sense of sight to contemplate supernatural things, such as a cherubim and seraphim. So much more direct. And the only thing that comes close is with taste and the Eucharist. But of sight kind of coming to the fore, and going on 2 pages up, 361 being the second full paragraph. In spite of an occasional mention of spiritual organs and senses, and he's quoting a region here, in Evagrius, everything is, who's another person who gets a lot of play here. Origen and Evagrius tend to get the most attention in this last bit. In Evagrius, everything is absorbed into an inescapable mystical reduction to unity. And Atticus, him again, 2 expressly allows for only one spiritual sense, the mystical sense of God. But Origen's 5 senses again emerge in Pseudo-Macarius, who indeed takes up and gives his own account of many other Origenistic themes. And Balthasar, which one do you agree with? What are you saying? It's like I'm very frozen. Like, what do you think? Like, if I already guess, that because he sins to fold so much into seeing that he is more of the sort of like a single spiritual sense in this case. But sometimes he posits revelation as almost a sense.
Right.
And one of those cases, is in the introduction, he quoted so many bits from so many, theologians I want to read more of. Like, he's like, so, are you saying that you agree or you don't agree? It's like, Christopher, James says, you're short and ugly. Are you saying I'm short and ugly? He's like, well, Jim says you're not. I'm like, well, what? What do you think here? Why are you bringing this up? Tell me what you think. And that was a case of there's a wonderful opportunity for a thesis statement here.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think one of the great challenges of this is, I reading this has been like in some ways an education in itself, where we're getting these names, many of whom I've not read, right? There's a certain density to the text, but we saw a scope of it in the introduction, but I ultimately want to know, where is Balthasar landing on some of these questions, because so much of it is just this really rich informational presentation about ideas and etc.
And we know he lands somewhere. Otherwise, he would not be as controversial as he is.
Right.
And I have resisted going to Wikipedia to understand, because I want to get to it myself. And also, I suspect that Wikipedia would probably not give me the best answer.
I've also done the same thing. Yeah.
Really not a complete one. But that was because this last bit there, where he get, what was it called again? The spirit and the senses.
Was it integration, that part?
Yeah, or just after he does the traditions and the archetypes. And there's the spiritual senses. And I should mention that he does go into the medieval tradition, the modern tradition. They're interesting. He quotes a lot of thinkers. I'm not sure how much they add relative to those more scripturally based, where there's traditions, of Peter, Paul, the Old Testament, Mary, the Gospels, or the Apostolic. But this here, the spiritual senses, it feels like he's getting to it. He's set up, these things, the experience of faith, and what do the senses do? And the senses, because you think these senses as being necessary for ascetic. This has got to be the key bit, right? And I was like, well, probably. but we still don't know where he lands. And it bugged the heck out of me. I do think he lands visually, but
that's right. Well, I'm wondering again if it's just building, because I know our next section is the objective evidence, right? So I'm wondering if he's going to sort of say, okay, I set up these different experiences and and senses. Here's the hard objective evidence for all of these things.
and I did think in my Plato obsession 384 after a quote, actually still quoting from someone else. This is why Thomas says that the senses do not learn, but act rather as someone who has learned from the outset, which does sound a bit like the Meno.
Right.
And it's the first time I think that, well, he never quotes Plato here. Plato doesn't come up. It does seem something from Plato that gets a purely positive. I think so. Or it could be later the next one to go like, and of course, I said earlier that Thomas said the senses do not know, but like that's obviously complete garbage, as I've proven. I don't think so, because it does fit in well with Revelation, which he seems to tie to gnosis, which I love because I want that word to come back. But I found the spiritual senses frustrating. Most of my notes were about questions of sight, and he does. He talks about secondhand experiences, which is how we experience what Paul, what Peter, what the apostles experienced, what Mary experienced. This is just from my own sort of notes. I am thinking of this aesthetically. Could these be connected to a work of art? What I wrote down here, whether apostolic experience is comparable to an artist whose visions mediate to us through his work of art. That's me. That's not Balthasar. But as he talks about this sort of secondhand, this mediate through other sources, and that's what the spiritual senses is a way about. That section is about how do we see God in the world in the sense of like, seeing patterns, seeing providence, seeing, divine hand. It is more of how, having not been there for the bush, burning bush, having not been there for Christ on earth, having not been knocked off our ride on the way to Damascus, how do we sense God,
Right.
sense the divine? How do we trust? How do we have trust in these secondhand things? Have trust in the magisterium. Diverging into a controversial, some people digression.
Right.
Talking to someone about vaccines and stuff, and scientific, authority of like, what do you trust those? Do you actually, trust, that the doctors know what they're doing, that the vaccines work? I was like, I'm a Catholic. My whole thing is based upon trusting
That's
what
right.
other people have said and read. I trust the magisterium. I trust that the gospels are true. I trust that Paul is not a Cartesian evil demon trying to lead me astray. Yes, I trust in authority.
That's right.
And he is not saying that. But he is, dealing with the question of, I didn't see Christ. I didn't carry Christ. I didn't talk to Christ or talk to God under a tree. How do I know? How can I sense God? How can I sense the truth of it? And he does go with a, as I said earlier, the real answer. He lists multiple ways in one paragraph. Well, so and so says this, but he says this and says this, and goes like, which one do you think? I don't know. I suspect it will come down to something kind of revelatory.
I think so too.
Though I am 100% not sure. I think there is towards the very end of what we read here. This is the end of 4:13, beginning of 4:14. There is one image, again, image, however, which stands wholly by itself, and which is like no other image instituted by the Son of Man, who bore and atoned for the guilt of all men on the cross. This is the image of the fellow man we encounter. In his plight and guilt, our fellow man, as we encounter him, is in every case our neighbor, and this neighbor of man's is Christ. Of passing, and this is, and I know because it didn't seem foreshadowed. It's a wonderful, beautiful, compassionate. I don't feel I agree with it. I don't feel it's something he has been building towards, but it is a wonderful bit of how we can have a spiritual sense, not in the sense of revelation, except in a broader sense of like we have the revelation that we are all brothers and sisters in Christ and all part of one body. That our sense of sight, he does say image, brings us to encounter God through seeing our fellow. And I said, I fellow human being. So I don't think it is necessarily something he is built towards.
Right.
But it was absolutely beautiful, I thought.
I thought so. Yeah, there's a really striking image. And again, I think it gets to that the kind of image of self-emptying, self-giving, right? Like we give ourselves to our fellow man, right? In this fellow, in our fellow man, we see Christ.
And that man, it says, and this neighbor of man's is Christ. Yeah.
Right.
So in a sense, obviously not in the same sense, at least one hopes not, because that would be a little heretical, that Christ is present in the Eucharist. Christ is present, and Christ is other people.
Right.
Obviously, the famous, what you do for the least of us, you do for me.
Right.
And that direct encounter, that is, and maybe that's what it is, that he is offering, not necessarily convincingly for me, but a way that we can have the experience that Paul and Peter and Mary and John and all the other apostles had by encountering our fellow man.
Right.
It's beautiful. I agree with it. It's not convincing in the sense that way he's built up theologically here. But I thought it was a really nice thing to end on. And I do think, you mentioned mysticism. I do think he kind of suggests that the Pauline experience is mystical, and that is not embodied in the same way the others are, and that maybe he's suggesting that mystical is in a way non-embodied. I don't know. Certainly you could argue either way, that mystical experiences are embodied, and that's what makes them important. I have never had a mystical experience in that sense, so I'm not gonna speak confidently on that. And it doesn't make up for me that this last bit, the spiritual senses, I don't think provided a good progression of the rest of the section. It was not a great coda in that it didn't seem to, it neither summed up nor it hinted at other things. I think you might be right that like this is incomplete because it continues in the next section.
Yeah.
Definitely left feeling incomplete.
I think that's right. And again, I wish I knew Latin and such. So like that Latin phrase at the end there, where and yet as our own sentences with them, our spirit, a whole person that dying with Christ, rising to the Father, et incarne mea videvo Deum meum quam visursus sum ego ipse et oculi me conspirasunt et non alias. I know I just butchered that Latin. I know like 2 words in there. Damn, of course, is God. Ego, I think, is me or I. But the other bit, I don't know what that means. So,
Oh my God, all I am, therefore, that's
and should I have looked that up? Yeah, probably,
highly
but
inadequate guess.
Yeah, so.
And he does a lot. He also, there's ancient Greek in here as well.
Right.
Untranslated. Or not always, sometimes untranslated. It's like, well, as a region said, and then their Greek letters go like, well, what'd he say?
Yeah, right.
This means nothing to me. Despite, my complaints about some of this, I really did enjoy the experience of faith.
Yeah, no, me too. I mean, again, I think we're reading something important here, and I'm just, again, I'm eager to see where it goes. I know we've both said this a lot for each of our conversations, but I mean that. I'm eager to see where this goes.
I feel like there's less table setting.
Right.
Now, the last bit maybe was a bit of table setting, but earlier on, the subject of faith felt like table setting. We talked about either last and the time before that sometimes I felt that he was doing a bit of CYA.
Yeah, right.
Cover, make sure he couldn't be accused of being heretical. But this really, most of the experience of faith, especially what we read today, excluding spiritual senses, with all due respect, felt less like table setting and really like establishing, I think this is correct. Yeah. I think this is how things are. And I was excited when I finished. I was like, oh my gosh, we are, the next section picks up on 419. It's like, we're not nearly done. But, we got less than 200 pages left, actually, which felt like, when we first started this, it's so big and, you read 100 pages, like, well, that's just the introduction. It's like, well, heck. And we're getting there. I had a Barnes & Noble gift card, and I actually did break down after I saw it halfway done. I did buy the next book.
Oh, good.
They have it. Granted, we're still several weeks away, minimum, from being there. I'm guessing at least 4 more meetings like this, if not 5. But I am looking forward to the next section. Says the objective evidence, with the first section being I should have read that, sir. The need for an objective form of revelation.
Okay.
Back to revelation. I think we're getting back to some gnosis. All right, I'm here for this.
Excellent.
Any final thoughts?
No, I'm excited to see do the next section, and I'm learning something from our conversations and from the text, and I'm glad we're kind of creating a bubble here where we're not going to secondary literature or Wikipedia. We're just kind of staying within our mode here.
Yeah, and as is certainly mentioned in discussions, I had some like revelations myself, like, that is why he had the church and ahead of Peter and Paul, and understanding some stuff while talking about, which is the great thing about these kind of conversations.
That's right.
And we'll be in touch soon as we get a better idea of how as we start reading and seeing how far we can get along before we need to pick a time to stop and talk. I wouldn't say at the top of my head, I'm looking at some of these sections, Christ the center, that feels like a biggie.
Yeah.
Should be good.
Absolutely. Well, thank you as always, Christopher.
Thank you, John. And I will talk to you about von Balthasar soon.
Sounds good.